November 20th, 1917, 6:20 in the morning. Western Front near Cambrai, France. Tank Commander Captain Harold Mortimer stood in the commander's cupola of his Mark IV tank, designated H-42, watching fog roll across no man's land like a living thing. The air tasted of cordite and wet earth. His hands, still trembling from the cold, gripped the iron rim as the diesel engine beneath him coughed to life. A deep, guttural roar that vibrated through his boots and into his chest. Around him, in the pre-dawn darkness, 476 other tanks materialized from the mist, like prehistoric beasts emerging from some mechanical underworld. No preliminary bombardment, no whistles, no screaming charges across open ground. Just the grinding, relentless forward crawl of steel toward the Hindenburg Line, the most heavily fortified defensive system in military history. Mortimer felt his stomach tighten. They were about to attempt something no army had ever done. Break through reinforced concrete and barbed wire, not with men, but with machines. The fog swallowed the sound of their approach. For perhaps the last time in this war, they had surprise on their side. Mortimer had been in France for 18 months. He'd seen the Somme. He'd survived Passchendaele. He'd watched entire divisions dissolve into the mud, thousands of men transformed into casualty statistics, for battles that gained, at best, a few hundred yards of cratered earth. The Western Front had become a mathematical obscenity, a calculus of attrition where victory meant losing fewer men than the enemy while accomplishing nothing of strategic value. Infantry attacks followed a predictable sequence. Days of artillery bombardment that destroyed surprise and turned the battlefield into an impassable morass, followed by waves of men climbing from trenches to walk into machine gun fire. The generals called it breakthrough strategy. The soldiers called it suicide. But this morning felt different. Mortimer commanded 8 tons of riveted steel plating, armed with 2 6-pounder guns and 4 Hotchkiss machine guns. His crew, 7 men crammed into a space barely larger than a garden shed, had trained for 3 months on the new tactics. No preliminary bombardment meant the ground remained solid. The tanks could move, and move they would, directly through obstacles that had stopped every previous offensive cold. The concept of armored warfare represented not revolutionary, genius but systematic problem-solving applied to an intractable tactical situation. By 1917, the Western Front had crystallized into a defensive stalemate defined by mutually reinforcing technologies: rapid-fire artillery, magazine-fed machine guns, and barbed wire. These 3 elements created killing zones that conventional infantry tactics could not overcome. Artillery destroyed attacking formations before they reached enemy lines. Machine guns massacred survivors who made it across no man's land. Barbed wire channeled advancing troops into predetermined fire lanes, where defensive positions achieved maximum lethality. The mathematics were brutal and unchanging. Attackers needed roughly 3-to-1 numerical superiority to overcome prepared defenses, but even overwhelming numbers couldn't compensate for the fundamental problem. Human bodies cannot advance across open ground faster than bullets can traverse that same space. Something had to change the equation. That something was the tank, though not the mythologized war-winning wonder weapon of popular imagination. The reality was far more complex, more human, and ultimately more interesting than simple technological determinism suggests. The British Mark IV tank emerged from coordinated development efforts spanning multiple engineering disciplines and military branches. Its design reflected hard-won lessons from earlier models deployed in 1916, which had demonstrated both promise and profound limitations. The Mark IV weighed 28 tons fully loaded. Its armor, 12 millimeters at thickest points, could stop rifle bullets and shell fragments, but remained vulnerable to direct artillery hits. The engine, a Daimler 6-cylinder producing 105 horsepower, pushed the vehicle to a maximum speed of 4 miles per hour, slower than walking pace. Inside, temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon monoxide from the engine mixed with cordite fumes from the guns. The noise was physically painful, a grinding, screeching cacophony that made verbal communication impossible. Crews communicated through hand signals and by hitting each other with hammers to get attention. The suspension consisted of unsprung tracks, meaning every bump and shell crater transmitted directly into the crew compartment, throwing men against hot metal surfaces. After 4 hours inside a Mark IV, most crew members were partially deaf, thoroughly nauseated, and covered in bruises and burns. Yet these machines could do something no number of infantry could accomplish: cross barbed wire, suppress machine gun positions, and survive in no man's land long enough to create breaches in defensive lines. The tactical innovation at Cambrai emerged from rethinking how armoured vehicles integrated into combined arms operations. Previous tank deployments had treated them as mobile pillboxes supporting conventional infantry assaults, impressive but ultimately subordinate to traditional tactics. Lieutenant Colonel J.F.C. Fuller, Chief of Staff for the Tank Corps, proposed inverting that relationship. Tanks would lead the attack, not support it. They would move en masse, concentrating overwhelming force at specific breakthrough points rather than dispersing across broad frontages. Most revolutionary, they would attack without preliminary artillery bombardment, preserving both surprise and trafficable ground. Infantry would follow the tanks, exploiting gaps the armour created rather than creating those gaps themselves. Cavalry, yes. Cavalry in 1917 would pour through breakthroughs to exploit success in the enemy rear. The plan required perfect coordination between arms that traditionally operated independently, precise navigation across featureless terrain, and flawless timing, synchronized without radio communication. It also required something that had been absent from the Western Front since 1914. Operational surprise. The Germans had no idea what was coming. The Hindenburg Line represented German defensive engineering at its apex. Constructed during the winter of 1916-1917, it stretched from Arras to Soissons, a defensive network deliberately positioned to shorten German front lines and free troops for mobile reserves. The forward zone consisted of multiple trench lines protected by belts of barbed wire 30 feet deep in places. Machine gun positions were sited to create interlocking fields of fire, every approach covered by multiple weapons from multiple angles. Concrete pillboxes with walls 3 feet thick housed artillery observers and command posts. Behind the forward trenches lay support lines, then reserve positions, then artillery parks positioned to deliver pre-registered fire onto any penetration. The Germans called it defense in depth, a system designed to absorb attacks, channel them into killing zones, then annihilate them with counterattacks. It had stopped every British and French offensive since its completion. The wire alone would have halted traditional infantry assaults. British reconnaissance had identified sections with 60-foot wide entanglements, obstacles that would take engineers hours to cut under fire, assuming they survived long enough to try. The Germans considered this section of line impregnable. They were about to learn otherwise. At 6:20 precisely, Mortimer's tank lurched forward. No whistles, no officers blowing horns, no dramatic speeches, just the grinding engagement of gears and the forward crawl of steel. Through his vision slits, narrow horizontal openings that provided minimal forward visibility, Mortimer watched the wire approach. His driver, a former bus operator from Manchester named Dawes, maintained steady throttle. The tank didn't slow. It didn't stop. It drove directly into the wire entanglement at 4 miles per hour. The wire caught on the tracks, wrapped around the sponsons, tore at the hull. For a moment, the tank seemed to hesitate, grinding against the obstacle like a ship running aground. Then the sheer weight and power pushed through. The wire snapped, compressed beneath the tracks, or simply pulled free of its moorings. The tank crushed a 30-foot path through obstacles that had stopped thousands of men. Behind Mortimer's tank, 476 others were doing the same thing across a 6-mile front. The Hindenburg Line was being systematically shredded by machines that couldn't be stopped by wire, suppressed by machine guns, or demoralized by artillery. The Germans, watching from their trenches, saw metal monsters emerging from the fog, crushing their defenses, driving toward them with inexorable mechanical indifference. Some stayed and fought. Many ran. Some stayed and fought. Many ran. The technology that made the Mark IV effective wasn't sophisticated. It was pragmatic. The tank's tracks distributed its weight across a large surface area, reducing ground pressure and allowing it to cross soft ground that would bog down wheeled vehicles. The tracks themselves consisted of linked steel plates wrapped around a rhomboid-shaped hull, a design that maximized trench crossing capability by extending the track contact patch far forward and aft of the center of gravity. When the tank approached a trench, the forward portion of the track would cant downward into the gap, while the rear portion remained on solid ground, creating a bridge of sorts that the vehicle could cross, theoretically. In practice, crossing trenches required precise speed control, perfect alignment, and considerable luck. Too fast, and the tank would nose into the opposite trench wall and become stuck. Too slow, and it would settle into the bottom and lack power to climb out. The recommended procedure involved approaching at walking pace, maintaining steady throttle as the nose dropped into the trench, then full throttle as the center of gravity crossed the gap. Crews practiced on training trenches in England. Now they were attempting it under fire, in fog, while being shot at by increasingly panicked German defenders. Inside H-42, the experience transcended mechanical operation and entered the realm of sensory assault. The engine noise, a hammering diesel roar, made thought difficult and conversation impossible. Cordite smoke from the guns mixed with carbon monoxide from the exhaust, creating a choking atmosphere that burned eyes and lungs. The temperature climbed past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Metal surfaces became hot enough to raise blisters on unprotected skin. When German bullets struck the armor, and they struck constantly, the impacts created sprays of molten lead and steel fragments that ricocheted inside the crew compartment. These splash effects blinded and wounded crew members who forgot to wear their chainmail masks. Yes, chainmail, a medieval technology repurposed for industrial warfare. Mortimer's face was covered by a leather helmet and chainmail visor that made him look like some nightmare amalgamation of knight and machine. It was necessary. Earlier tank crews who'd fought without face protection had been blinded by metal splash. The human cost of armoured warfare wasn't glorious. It was brutal, grinding and exhausting. But it was survivable in ways that infantry attacks across open ground were not. The breakthrough came at sections of the Hindenburg Line near Flesquières and Havrincourt. British tanks, advancing in waves with infantry following 50 yards behind, simply overwhelmed German defensive positions through concentration of force and surprise. Machine gun positions that could have massacred conventional infantry attacks found themselves facing armoured targets their weapons couldn't penetrate. German troops tried shooting at vision slits, attempting to kill commanders and drivers, some threw grenades, ineffective against 12 millimeters of armour plate. Others attempted to flee to secondary positions, only to discover more tanks had already penetrated past the forward trenches and were operating in their rear areas. The psychological impact of facing an enemy your weapons can't harm, that advances regardless of your fire, that crushes obstacles and positions beneath steel tracks. This impact proved as decisive as the physical destruction. By midday, British forces had advanced 5 miles in some sectors, more territorial gain than any offensive since 1914 had achieved in months of fighting. The Hindenburg Line, supposedly impenetrable, had been breached in hours. The age of armoured warfare had announced itself with mechanical finality, but breakthrough didn't mean victory. This brutal lesson would be learned, forgotten, and relearned throughout the remainder of the war and beyond. By mid-afternoon, November 20th, the advancing British forces faced a problem more fundamental than German resistance: logistics. Tanks broke down. Of 476 vehicles that began the attack, fewer than half remained operational by afternoon. Mechanical failures, broken tracks, overheated engines, transmission breakdowns claimed more tanks than enemy fire. Those that survived combat had exhausted their fuel. The Mark IV carried 65 gallons of petrol, enough for roughly 25 miles of travel under ideal conditions. Combat conditions were never ideal. Crossing trenches, crushing wire, climbing obstacles, all consumed fuel at accelerated rates. By day's end, British armour had outrun its supply lines. Fuel trucks and repair vehicles couldn't navigate the cratered ground the tanks had crossed. The breakthrough couldn't be exploited because the weapons that created it couldn't sustain operations deep in enemy territory. The cavalry, supposedly waiting to exploit success, discovered that barbed wire and trenches remained as effective against horses as ever. The Germans, recovering from initial shock, brought up reserves and artillery. The Battle of Cambrai, which began with stunning success, would end in stalemate by early December. But something had changed irreversibly. The German response to Cambrai revealed both tactical adaptability and strategic insight. Initial panic gave way to systematic analysis. German military observers noted that tanks, while formidable, had exploitable vulnerabilities. They were slow, mechanically unreliable, and required specific terrain conditions to operate effectively. Most critically, they couldn't hold ground, only take it. Infantry still needed to occupy conquered positions. German counter-tactics evolved rapidly. Artillery batteries trained to engage armour with direct fire, using high-explosive shells to immobilize or destroy tanks. Infantry received training in close assault techniques, approaching disabled tanks to attack vision slits and hatches with grenades and flamethrowers. Most effective, German doctrine emphasized immediate counterattacks to recapture lost positions before British infantry could consolidate. These adaptations transformed tanks from invulnerable monsters to dangerous but manageable threats. Yet German officers recognized something British commanders were slower to understand. Armored warfare represented not just new weapons, but entirely new operational possibilities. The Hindenburg Line had been broken not through superior numbers or industrial attrition, but through concentrated application of mechanical force at decisive points. That lesson would shape German operational thinking for the next war. Private Ernst Junger, German stormtrooper and later acclaimed author, witnessed the Cambrai attack from German positions. His memoir, Storm of Steel, captures the psychological impact with clinical precision. The appearance of the tanks created profound unease. One watched these steel colossi approach with a sensation of helplessness. Bullets bounced from them harmlessly. Our machine guns, so effective against infantry, produced no visible effect. The psychological superiority they possessed was substantial. Even the bravest defender found his confidence shaken when confronting an enemy his weapons couldn't harm. We learned to cope with them, learned to keep our nerve, learned to target their weaknesses. But that initial encounter, when they emerged from the fog like mechanical demons, crushing our wire as if it were thread, that memory remained disturbing. Junger's observation captures the essential nature of technological disruption in warfare. The first encounter with a truly new capability produces effects disproportionate to its actual lethality. Defenders don't know the weapon's limitations. Attackers can't yet exploit its full potential. The innovation exists in a temporary state of maximum psychological impact before adaptation reduces it to merely another element in combined arms operations. This window of vulnerability, when defenders haven't adapted but attackers possess temporary advantage, defines the strategic value of military innovation. The tank crews themselves experienced the battle through a lens of mechanical immediacy that left little room for strategic contemplation. Captain D.G. Brown, commanding officer of a Mark IV at Cambrai, recorded his experience. We advanced through the wire as planned, though the resistance was greater than expected. The wire wrapped around our tracks and sponsons. Twice we had to reverse and maneuver to break free. German bullets created a continuous hammering against the hull, sound like rain on a tin roof, except each raindrop carried deadly intent. Inside, the heat became unbearable. My gunner collapsed from heat exhaustion. We stopped, administered water, and continued. Crossing the first trench nearly ended us. Our nose dropped into the gap. We applied full throttle, and for a terrible moment, the engine stalled. Then it caught. We climbed the far side and continued. Behind us, I could see infantry following, using our path through the wire. The satisfaction of seeing our tactics work, of watching obstacles that had stopped so many men simply dissolve before our advance, that feeling justified every hardship of tank service. We drove for 3 hours before mechanical failure stopped us. The transmission gave out. We were perhaps 4 miles beyond our start line, deeper into enemy territory than British forces had reached in 3 years of fighting. We destroyed the guns, abandoned the vehicle, and walked back through our lines. My crew and I were deaf for 2 days afterward. The mechanical specifications of the Mark IV reveal engineering compromises necessary when developing unprecedented technologies under wartime urgency. The hull consisted of riveted armor plates. Welding technology wasn't yet adequate for large-scale armored vehicle production. Riveting created vulnerable points where bullet impacts could shear rivets, creating internal projectiles as dangerous as external fire. The suspension system, or rather lack thereof, meant the entire crew compartment absorbed every shock from uneven ground. The engine, mounted at the rear of the fighting compartment without effective isolation, transferred noise, heat, and exhaust directly into crew spaces. Visibility consisted of narrow slits and small prism periscopes, adequate for general navigation, but insufficient for precise targeting or situational awareness. The sponson-mounted guns required crew members to stand exposed in small projecting compartments on each side of the hull, operating weapons in spaces so confined that spent shell casings had to be thrown out of hatches to make room for continued firing. These weren't design flaws, but necessary compromises when creating entirely new weapon systems without precedent. Each limitation would be addressed in subsequent tank generations, but the Mark IV represented what was achievable given 1917 industrial capabilities, metallurgical knowledge and mechanical engineering. It was crude, uncomfortable, and barely adequate. It was also sufficient to accomplish what no previous weapon could achieve: break the Western Front stalemate through mobile armoured assault. The integration of tanks into combined arms tactics required fundamental reconsideration of infantry training and operational doctrine. Traditional infantry tactics emphasized linear formations, coordinated fire, and frontal assaults. Tank infantry cooperation demanded decentralized initiative, small unit tactics, and rapid exploitation of breakthrough opportunities. Infantry following tanks needed to move quickly through gaps in enemy defenses before those gaps could be sealed. They needed to clear trenches and bunkers that tanks bypassed or couldn't reduce with main armament fire. They needed to protect tanks from close assault teams attempting to disable the vehicles. This mutual dependence, tanks providing mobile firepower and breakthrough capability, infantry providing consolidation and security, created operational complexity that military organizations struggled to implement. Commanders accustomed to directing battalions as single entities had to coordinate multiple weapon systems with different capabilities, limitations, and operational tempos. Communication challenges amplified coordination problems. Tanks lacked radios in 1917. Infantry units used runners and signal flags, coordinating a combined arms assault across churned terrain through enemy fire while maintaining timing and mutual support. This required training, practice, and operational experience that British forces were only beginning to develop at Cambrai. The logistical requirements of armoured warfare revealed themselves as brutally limiting factors. Each Mark IV consumed fuel, ammunition, and spare parts at rates conventional infantry units couldn't approach. A single tank required approximately 65 gallons of petrol for a day's operations, plus 200 rounds of 6-pounder ammunition, 10,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition, oil for the engine, grease for the tracks, and cooling water. Multiply by 476 tanks, and the supply requirements become staggering. British logistics systems, designed around supporting infantry divisions with rifle ammunition, food, and artillery shells, proved inadequate for mechanized warfare's demands. Supply trucks bogged down in mud and shell craters. Fuel couldn't reach forward positions. Ammunition ran short. Maintenance facilities couldn't keep pace with breakdown rates. By the second day of Cambrai, more tanks sat immobilized from lack of fuel or spare parts than from combat damage. This limitation, the tyranny of logistics over tactical success, would characterize armored warfare throughout its development. Breakthrough capacity meant nothing without sustainment capacity. The British had created a weapon that could break defensive lines, but lacked the logistical infrastructure to exploit those breakthroughs operationally. This gap between tactical success and operational exploitation would persist until military organizations developed supply systems specifically designed for mechanized warfare's appetite. German artillery proved the most effective counter to British armor at Cambrai. Field guns, repositioned to fire directly at advancing tanks rather than providing indirect fire support, could penetrate Mark IV armor at ranges under 1,000 meters. The German 77mm field gun, designed for high-angle fire against infantry and fortifications, proved remarkably effective in the direct fire role when crews overcame their initial shock and engaged armor systematically. Tank crews reported multiple instances of German batteries holding position to engage tanks at close range, suicidal tactics against conventional attacks, but effective against armoured vehicles that couldn't rapidly manoeuvre and whose main armament fired too slowly to suppress artillery positions effectively. The Germans also employed captured Belgian 37mm anti-tank guns, weapons specifically designed for armour penetration, though in limited numbers. These small mobile guns could be positioned in concealed positions and engage tanks from ambush, penetrating armour with armour-piercing shot. The vulnerability of tanks to direct-fire artillery established a tactical relationship that would persist throughout armoured warfare's evolution. Tanks dominate infantry and fortifications, but remain vulnerable to dedicated anti-tank weapons, creating a complex tactical calculus where combined arms cooperation becomes essential for success. Neither tanks nor infantry could operate independently with safety. Each required the other's support against specific threats. The collapse of the Cambrai offensive by early December demonstrated that breakthrough capability alone couldn't achieve strategic victory. British forces, after advancing 5 miles in the first day, an unprecedented achievement by Western Front standards, found themselves overextended, undersupplied, and vulnerable to counterattack. German forces, recovering from initial shock, launched massive counteroffensives on November 30th, using stormtrooper tactics refined on the Eastern Front. These specialized infantry units, trained in infiltration techniques and combined arms assault, recaptured most lost territory within a week. The British, lacking reserves to consolidate their gains and unable to supply forces deep in enemy territory, withdrew to defensive positions. Casualties on both sides approached 45,000 men. Territorial gains proved minimal. By traditional metrics, Cambrai was another costly stalemate, but this assessment missed the battle's true significance. Cambrai proved that the Western Front's stalemate could be broken. Properly employed armor, integrated with infantry and artillery, could achieve breakthrough. The technological and tactical pieces existed. What remained was developing operational and strategic frameworks to exploit tactical success, a challenge that would occupy military thinkers through the interwar period and into the next global conflict. The British Tank Corps, despite Cambrai's ultimate outcome, emerged from the battle with validated tactics and growing confidence. Tank crews had proven their vehicles could accomplish what conventional forces could not. Infantry officers who'd coordinated with armor recognized its breakthrough potential. Senior commanders saw, if briefly, what mobile operations might achieve. This psychological impact, the demonstration of possibility, mattered as much as tactical lessons. Wars aren't won purely through attrition and defense. Offensive capability, the ability to dictate operational tempo and force decisive engagements, remained strategically essential. Tanks provided that capability, however imperfectly. The challenge became improving reliability, increasing production, and developing operational concepts that could sustain breakthrough momentum beyond the first day of attack. The British response involved massive expansion of tank production, creation of dedicated tank training facilities, and development of more reliable vehicles. The Mark V tank, introduced in mid-1918, incorporated improved engines, better transmissions, and simplified controls that allowed a single crew member to drive rather than requiring 4 men to operate steering and throttle. These incremental improvements mattered enormously in aggregate, transforming tanks from breakthrough weapons to sustainable operational systems. The summer of 1918 demonstrated how tactical lessons from Cambrai could be applied systematically. British and French forces launched multiple offensives, employing hundreds of tanks in coordinated attacks. The Battle of Amiens, beginning August 8, 1918, became what German General Erich Ludendorff called the Black Day of the German Army, a combined arms assault featuring over 500 tanks that shattered German defensive positions and advanced 8 miles on the first day. Unlike Cambrai, Allied forces had learned to maintain operational momentum. Supply systems delivered fuel and ammunition to advancing units. Reserve formations exploited breakthroughs rather than allowing gaps to be sealed. The attacks continued for weeks rather than days, grinding down German defensive capacity through sustained pressure. This operational approach, repeated hammer blows using combined arms teams with armor as breakthrough elements, characterized Allied offensives through war's end. Tanks hadn't won the war alone. Infantry, artillery, aircraft, logistics, and industrial production all contributed. But armor had broken the stalemate, demonstrating that defensive lines could be pierced and exploitation possible. The Western Front resumed movement after 3 years of static warfare. Germany, unable to stem the tide and facing internal collapse, sought armistice. The human cost of developing armored warfare remains difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Tank crews suffered casualty rates comparable to infantry, despite their armored protection. Fire represented the paramount fear. Petrol engines and ammunition stored in confined spaces created catastrophic risks when armor was penetrated. Crews burned to death trapped inside vehicles that became ovens. Others suffocated from carbon monoxide poisoning when ventilation systems failed or were damaged. Heat exhaustion claimed men during summer operations. Frostbite struck during winter. The physical toll of operating in extreme conditions, noise, vibration, toxic fumes, temperature extremes, left permanent damage. Many tank veterans suffered hearing loss, respiratory problems, and psychological trauma. They'd pioneered a new form of warfare inside machines that protected them from bullets, but subjected them to environmental extremes and mechanical hazards infantry never faced. Their memoirs describe pride in their accomplishments mixed with horror at the conditions they endured. They'd broken the stalemate. They'd saved countless infantry lives by providing breakthrough capability. But the cost to themselves, measured in destroyed health and traumatic experience, remained severe. This human dimension of technological warfare, the way machines both protect and harm those who operate them, deserves recognition equal to tactical achievements. The strategic implications of Cambrai extended far beyond 1917. Military organizations worldwide studied the battle, drawing conclusions that would shape interwar doctrine and prepare conceptual ground for the next conflict. German officers, particularly junior leaders who'd experienced the attack firsthand, recognized that mobility and concentration of force could overcome defensive positions previously considered impregnable. This lesson influenced German rearmament and tactical development in the 1930s, contributing to blitzkrieg doctrine that emphasized armored breakthrough, rapid exploitation, and combined arms integration. French military leadership drew opposite conclusions: that tanks were useful infantry support weapons, but insufficient for independent operations, a perspective that would prove catastrophically flawed in 1940. British armoured warfare theorists, including J.F.C. Fuller and B.H. Liddell Hart, developed concepts for deep armoured operations and mechanised warfare that influenced military thinking globally, but remained imperfectly implemented by the British Army itself. The Soviet Union, observing Western Front battles and conducting its own theoretical work, developed deep operations doctrine that integrated armour, infantry, artillery, and air power into coordinated offensive systems. American military observers noted the importance of industrial production, mechanical reliability, and logistics in sustaining armoured operations. Each nation drew different lessons from the same evidence, shaping distinct approaches to mechanised warfare. The technological legacy of Cambrai manifests in every subsequent armoured fighting vehicle development. The Mark IV's shortcomings, poor visibility, inadequate crew protection from environmental hazards, mechanical unreliability, insufficient range, became design challenges that successive tank generations addressed with varying success. Interwar tank designs emphasized improved suspension systems, better engines, radio communication, rotating turrets for increased firepower flexibility, and thicker armor. By World War II, tanks had evolved into sophisticated fighting systems barely recognizable from their 1917 predecessors. Yet fundamental design tensions remained: armor protection versus mobility, firepower versus mechanical reliability, crew survivability versus vehicle size. These trade-offs, first confronted by Mark IV designers, continue shaping armored vehicle development. The M1 Abrams, Leopard 2, and Challenger 2, modern main battle tanks, represent evolutionary descendants of technologies pioneered at Cambrai. Their designers face the same challenge: creating mobile armoured platforms that protect crews, deliver firepower, and remain mechanically reliable under combat conditions. The solutions differ dramatically from 1917, but the problems remain fundamentally similar. This continuity across technological generations reveals how innovation builds incrementally on foundational breakthroughs rather than emerging from revolutionary discontinuity. Captain Harold Mortimer survived Cambrai and continued serving with the Tank Corps through war's end. His after-action reports, preserved in British military archives, capture both pride in accomplishment and recognition of limitations. He wrote, "We achieved what infantry could not, broke through positions that had stopped every previous attack, yet our success remained incomplete. We couldn't hold ground without infantry support. We couldn't advance beyond our fuel range. We couldn't communicate with supporting units or coordinate with adjacent formations. The tank, I believe, is essential for breakthrough but insufficient for exploitation. Future success requires treating armoured vehicles not as independent weapon systems, but as integrated components of combined arms teams. The cavalry dream that tanks would charge through enemy lines and win wars independently is fantasy. The reality is more prosaic but more promising. Tanks break defences, infantry consolidates gains, artillery suppresses counterattacks, and logistics sustains the advance. All elements must function together, or none function successfully." Mortimer's analysis, written by a company-grade officer from direct combat experience, captured truths that senior commanders would take decades to fully appreciate. The lesson of Cambrai wasn't that armour had revolutionised warfare in 1917, but that it had revealed possibilities that required organisational, doctrinal, and technological development to realise fully. The psychological impact of Cambrai on German defensive thinking proved as significant as its tactical lessons. The Hindenburg Line, symbol of impregnable defence, had been breached. German military leadership recognised that static defensive systems, however well engineered, couldn't guarantee security against combined arms assault. This recognition influenced German defensive doctrine for the remainder of World War I and beyond. German forces increasingly emphasized elastic defense, allowing attackers to penetrate forward positions, then destroying them through counterattacks that struck overextended forces from multiple directions. This approach, called defense in depth, prioritized destroying enemy forces over holding specific terrain. It required mobile reserves, rapid communication, and operational flexibility, capabilities that mechanization would enhance, but that remained conceptually independent of specific technologies. The Germans also accelerated development of anti-tank weapons, recognizing that armor would characterize future warfare. By 1918, German infantry units regularly employed armor-piercing ammunition, anti-tank rifles, and dedicated field guns positioned for direct fire against armored vehicles. These responses transformed tanks from invulnerable breakthrough weapons to vulnerable platforms requiring infantry protection, precisely the combined arms dependency that Mortimer had recognized. The dialectic between innovation and adaptation, between new capabilities and countermeasures, would drive military technological development through subsequent conflicts. The industrial implications of Cambrai highlighted emerging tensions between traditional craftsmanship and mass production in military hardware. Building tanks required capabilities beyond conventional armaments manufacturing. Large steel plates needed forming, shaping, and assembling with precision. Engines required specialized manufacturing knowledge. Tracks demanded metallurgical sophistication to balance durability with weight. Britain's industrial infrastructure, strained by 3 years of total war, struggled to meet tank production targets. Manufacturing quality varied wildly between production facilities. Some tanks reached France mechanically sound. Others broke down within hours. The British response involved standardizing production processes, concentrating manufacturing in facilities with necessary capabilities, and accepting that quantity sometimes mattered more than perfect quality. This tension between producing adequate numbers of acceptable equipment versus smaller quantities of superior equipment would characterize industrial warfare throughout the 20th century. The German approach emphasized quality and sophisticated engineering, producing smaller numbers of complex weapons. The British and American approach prioritized quantity and maintainability, accepting reduced individual unit capability in exchange for numerical superiority and simplified logistics. Neither approach proved universally superior. Effectiveness depended on strategic context, resource availability, and operational doctrine. But Cambrai demonstrated that industrial capacity, the ability to produce, maintain, and sustain complex mechanical systems in combat, mattered as much as tactical innovation in determining military outcomes. By November 1918, when armistice ended fighting on the Western Front, tanks had evolved from experimental curiosities to established weapon systems. British, French, German, and American forces all employed armor in various forms. Tactical doctrines had developed for their employment, industrial systems for their production, and logistical networks for their sustainment. Yet uncertainty remained about armor's future role. Tanks were expensive, mechanically complex, and required specialized training. Post-war military budgets declined sharply, and expensive mechanized forces faced scrutiny. Many senior officers, trained in pre-war cavalry and infantry traditions, questioned whether tanks justified their cost. The interwar period would witness intense debate about armor's proper role, debates resolved only by combat in the next global conflict. But the essential question posed at Cambrai remained central. How should military organizations integrate technological innovation into operational and strategic frameworks? Cambrai demonstrated that technology alone didn't win battles. Organizations did, through systematic development of doctrine, training, logistics, and leadership appropriate to new capabilities. This organizational challenge, more than technological capability, would determine which nations successfully transitioned to mechanized warfare and which remained trapped in outdated paradigms. The afternoon of November 20th, 1917, as British tanks ground to halt from fuel exhaustion and mechanical failure, presented a scene of exhausted triumph. Crews emerged from their vehicles, deafened, nauseated, burned and bruised, into captured German positions. Infantry consolidated gains, establishing defensive perimeters. Artillery displaced forward to support the advance. Supply units struggled across cratered ground, attempting to bring fuel and ammunition forward. German prisoners, thousands of them, streamed rearward under guard. The Hindenburg Line, that seemingly impenetrable barrier, lay breached in multiple locations. Church bells rang in London, celebrating the victory. Newspapers proclaimed the end of stalemate warfare. Yet experienced officers recognized the truth. They'd achieved breakthrough, not victory. The hard part, exploitation, consolidation, sustained advance, remained ahead. Within days, German counterattacks would demonstrate that breakthrough didn't guarantee strategic success. But for that afternoon, something felt different. The Western Front, static since 1914, had moved. Soldiers who'd spent years fighting for yards of ground had advanced miles in hours. The weapons that had made this possible sat cooling in the late autumn sun, their engines finally silent, their crews sprawled on the ground in exhaustion. They'd proven that stalemate could be broken, that defense didn't permanently dominate offense, that technology could shift warfare's calculus. Everything else, the strategic exploitation, the operational frameworks, the institutional adaptations, would follow from this fundamental demonstration. The forgotten trench war that broke the German line wasn't forgotten because it failed, but because it succeeded too slowly, too incompletely, too late in the war to achieve the decisive victory its initial hours promised. Cambrai demonstrated armoured warfare's potential while revealing its limitations. The battle validated combined arms tactics while exposing organisational inadequacies. It showed that industrial technology could overcome defensive positions while proving that logistics limited operational reach more effectively than enemy resistance. These contradictions, success and failure intertwined, potential demonstrated but unrealised, made Cambrai difficult to categorise in military history. It wasn't a decisive victory like Amiens or a catastrophic defeat like Third Ypres. It was something more ambiguous and ultimately more important, a proof of concept. The Mark IV tanks that broke the Hindenburg Line weren't wonder weapons, but adequate tools employed with tactical imagination and operational boldness. Their success opened possibilities that subsequent generations would explore more fully. The lessons of Cambrai, the importance of surprise, concentration of force, combined arms integration, and sustained logistics, would echo through military thinking for decades. Officers who served there would become interwar theorists and World War II commanders. Technologies pioneered at Cambrai would evolve into Panzers and Shermans and T-34s. The battle that contemporaries viewed as another costly stalemate was, in retrospect, the beginning of mechanized warfare's age. Walking the Cambrai battlefield today, a visitor finds little evidence of the mechanical drama that unfolded here. The trenches are gone, filled in and ploughed over. The wire has rusted away. The shell craters have softened into gentle depressions in farmers' fields. A few monuments mark specific locations, memorials to units that fought here, small plaques commemorating breakthrough points. The village churches, destroyed in 1917, have been rebuilt. The Hindenburg Line exists now only in aerial photographs and archaeological surveys, yet the ground itself remembers. Subsurface remains of concrete bunkers still resist ploughs, unexploded ordnance surfaces occasionally, requiring ordnance disposal teams to render safe shells fired a century ago. Farmers still turn up belt buckles, bullet casings, fragments of equipment, detritus of industrial warfare that worked itself into the soil. The landscape looks peaceful, almost pastoral. Nothing suggests that here, on a foggy November morning, machines broke through obstacles designed to stop human armies, changing warfare's fundamental calculus. The silence feels absolute, as if the mechanical roar of those 476 engines never echoed across these fields. But history remembers what landscape forgets. The human stories from Cambrai resist neat categorization into victory or defeat, heroism or tragedy. Lieutenant Cecil Lewis, Royal Flying Corps pilot flying reconnaissance over the battlefield, recorded his observations. From the air, the spectacle was extraordinary. Lines of tanks advancing like mechanical beetles, leaving crushed paths through the wire. German positions erupting in panic. Infantry following in files using the cleared paths. Artillery fire beginning to fall. But too late, the tanks were already through. It looked orderly, almost choreographed, as if someone had planned every movement. Only later, on the ground, did I learn of the chaos inside those tanks. The heat, the noise, the casualties from mechanical breakdown and enemy fire. From altitude, warfare looks clean. Close up, it's always a horror. Lewis's dual perspective. The orderly appearance from above versus the intimate chaos of actual combat captures a truth about technological warfare. It appears systematic and controlled from distance, but participants experience confusion, fear, and uncertainty regardless of mechanical assistance. Technology changes warfare's scale and lethality, but doesn't eliminate its fundamental human experience. German accounts of Cambrai reveal a different perspective: the psychological shock of facing threats existing weapons couldn't defeat. Hauptmann Wilhelm Balke, commanding a machine gun company in the Hindenburg Line, wrote, "November 20th began as routine defensive duty. Fog obscured visibility, but we'd experienced foggy mornings before. Then came sounds I couldn't initially identify. Mechanical grinding, metal on metal, growing louder. My men looked to me for explanation. I had none. Then shapes emerged from the fog. Tanks, dozens of them. We opened fire. Our machine guns were excellently positioned. Perfect interlocking fields of fire. The bullets bounced off. We might as well have been throwing stones. The tanks came on, crushing our wire, driving over our parapets. Some of my men ran. Others kept firing uselessly. I ordered withdrawal to secondary positions, but the tanks were already there. We'd been outflanked by machines that moved slower than we could walk, yet we couldn't escape them. Ultimately, we were captured. The British treated us correctly. I felt no shame in surrender. How do you fight steel with bullets? But the humiliation remained. Our positions, supposedly impregnable, had become traps when the enemy brought weapons our doctrine never anticipated. The medical aftermath of Cambrai revealed injuries unique to armoured warfare. British field hospitals treated tank crew members for burns, carbon monoxide poisoning, hearing damage, and psychological trauma distinct from infantry casualties. Doctors noted that tank casualties often presented with multiple, complex injuries, burns combined with shrapnel wounds, skull fractures from being thrown against metal surfaces, chemical burns from battery acid mixed with combat trauma. The confined spaces inside tanks meant that when armour was penetrated, all crew members typically suffered casualties. Surviving crews often witnessed horrific deaths of comrades in spaces so confined that escape was impossible. The psychological impact paralleled submarine warfare more than land combat. The terror of being trapped in a damaged, burning metal container with no means of rapid egress. Medical officers recommended specialized treatment protocols for tank casualties, recognizing that their injuries and trauma differed fundamentally from those of infantry or artillery crews. This recognition that different military specialties required different medical approaches represented another way technological warfare complicated military organization. Specialization bred not just tactical diversity, but administrative complexity cascading through every military system, from logistics to medicine to personnel management. The strategic debate following Cambrai centered on a question that remains relevant. How should military organizations balance innovation against existing capabilities? British resources were finite. Money spent on tanks couldn't be spent on artillery, infantry equipment, or naval construction. Senior commanders had to decide whether to double down on mechanization or hedge bets by maintaining diverse capabilities. Some argued that Cambrai proved tanks were war-winning weapons deserving maximum investment. Others contended that tanks remained too unreliable, too expensive, and too specialized for general employment. The debate reflected genuine uncertainty about technological warfare's future. No one in 1917 could predict with confidence how armoured warfare would evolve. The Mark IV represented cutting-edge technology, but also embodied numerous compromises and limitations. Would future tanks overcome these problems, or would inherent limitations prevent armour from achieving its theoretical potential? Different officers, looking at identical evidence, reached opposite conclusions. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, British Expeditionary Force commander, supported continued tank development but refused to prioritise it over conventional forces. Tank Corps officers advocated for massive expansion and independent armoured formations. Artillery officers argued that improved guns and ammunition could achieve breakthrough at lower cost. Each position contained logic and supporting evidence. Each proved partially correct and partially wrong. Managing this uncertainty, making resource allocation decisions about emerging technologies whose ultimate utility remains unclear, represents a permanent challenge for military institutions. The French parallel tank development provides instructive contrast to British experience. French designers, working independently, developed different solutions to similar problems. The Renault FT-17, deployed in 1918, represented revolutionary design. A light tank with rotating turret, rear-mounted engine, and forward driving position that established the configuration template for subsequent tank development. It was smaller, faster, and more reliable than British heavy tanks. Its design reflected different tactical thinking. The French emphasized numerous light tanks supporting infantry, rather than fewer heavy tanks creating breakthroughs. Both approaches had merit. British heavy tanks could cross wider trenches and carry heavier armament. French light tanks were easier to produce, maintain, and deploy. Neither nation possessed definitively superior technology. They developed different capabilities reflecting different doctrinal priorities. This divergence illustrated how tactical doctrine shapes technological development as much as technology shapes doctrine. Engineers don't design weapons in isolation. They respond to military requirements articulated by commanders based on operational concepts derived from strategic goals and institutional culture. The technology that emerges reflects this complex interaction. Understanding why different solutions emerge requires understanding not just engineering capabilities but institutional context shaping development priorities. American entry into the war brought industrial capacity that British and French manufacturers couldn't match. American factories possessed expertise in mass production techniques developed for automobiles that translated readily to tank manufacturing. The United States initially planned to produce British and French tank designs under license, then transitioned to indigenous designs. Production targets were ambitious. Thousands of tanks to equip American Expeditionary Force divisions by 1919. Actual production fell short due to technical challenges, material shortages, and the armistice ending the war before American industry fully mobilized. Yet American involvement demonstrated industrial warfare's emerging logic. Victory required not just tactical innovation, but production capacity to translate innovation into numerical superiority. German armor development, though technically sophisticated, couldn't compete with Allied industrial output. Germany produced fewer than 50 tanks during the entire war. Britain produced thousands. France produced thousands. The United States prepared to produce tens of thousands. This quantitative imbalance reflected broader strategic realities. The Allied powers commanded greater industrial resources, more extensive raw material access, and larger labor pools. Technology mattered, but so did industrial economics. Nations could possess excellent designs, but lose wars if they couldn't manufacture sufficient quantities. This lesson, that industrial capacity determines military outcomes in prolonged conflicts, would shape World War II, strategic planning, and Cold War force structure debates. The legacy of Cambrai extends beyond military history into broader questions about technological disruption and institutional adaptation. Why did some organizations successfully integrate tanks while others failed? Why did lessons obvious to junior officers remain contested among senior commanders? Why did successful tactical innovations translate slowly into operational and strategic frameworks? These questions resist simple answers. Institutional change proceeds unevenly, constrained by cultural inertia, resource limitations, competing priorities, and genuine uncertainty about optimal solutions. The British Army that fought at Cambrai was simultaneously trying to incorporate tanks, improve artillery tactics, integrate aircraft, manage unprecedented manpower demands, and sustain operations across multiple theatres. Tank integration was one challenge among many. Commanders who seemed conservative about mechanization weren't necessarily hidebound traditionalists. They were managing complex organizations under extreme pressure with imperfect information about emerging technologies. Similarly, tank advocates weren't necessarily visionaries. Some overestimated armor's capabilities and underappreciated combined arms complexity. History simplifies these debates into progressive reformers versus reactionary conservatives. But reality was messier. Most officers occupied middle positions, supporting tank development while questioning specific proposals or implementation approaches. Understanding why technological integration proceeds slowly requires appreciating organizational complexity and decision-making constraints, not just identifying technological possibilities. The tactical evolution from Cambrai through war's end demonstrated how rapidly military organizations can adapt when institutional commitment exists. Techniques that seemed revolutionary in November 1917 became routine by August 1918. Tank infantry coordination improved through repetition and refinement. Supply systems adjusted to mechanized warfare's demands. Tactics evolved to address German countermeasures. This adaptation occurred despite, or perhaps because of, continued combat pressure forcing rapid experimentation and learning. Military organizations in combat face powerful incentives to identify effective techniques and abandon ineffective ones. Casualties from failed tactics create immediate pressure for alternative approaches. Successful innovations spread informally through frontline units before formal doctrine incorporates them. This bottom-up innovation, driven by tactical necessity rather than institutional planning, generates adaptations that formal development processes might never produce. British tank tactics in late 1918 bore little resemblance to formal doctrine from early 1917, not because doctrine changed, but because field units improvised solutions to problems doctrine hadn't anticipated. The gap between formal doctrine and actual practice, what military theorists call emergent doctrine, represents crucial adaptation mechanisms that institutional planning alone cannot provide. Successful military organizations cultivate this informal innovation while ensuring successful experiments diffuse throughout the force. By 1919, as armies demobilized and wartime urgency faded, the future of armored warfare remained contested. Tank units were disbanded, production ceased, remaining vehicles entered storage or were scrapped. The massive industrial infrastructure created to manufacture tanks was redirected to peacetime purposes or simply abandoned. Within a few years, most nations maintained only token armored forces, experimental units for testing concepts and training cadres. This post-war reduction reflected both fiscal necessity and genuine uncertainty about armor's peacetime utility. Maintaining mechanized forces was expensive. Tanks required fuel, spare parts, specialized training, and dedicated facilities. Without immediate threats, such expenditures seemed unjustifiable. Yet some officers recognized that mechanized warfare's age had begun, regardless of peacetime reductions. They continued studying Cambrai and subsequent battles, developing theories about how armored forces might be employed in future conflicts. Their work, sometimes supported by, sometimes in opposition to institutional priorities, laid conceptual foundations for World War II armor doctrines. This interwar theorizing demonstrates that technological military revolutions don't occur entirely during wartime. The actual fighting reveals possibilities and limitations. The peacetime study and experimentation transforms those observations into operational concepts and institutional capabilities. Cambrai was a data point, an existence proof. The theorizing came later, in less dramatic but equally important work of synthesizing lessons into doctrine. Fuller, Liddell Hart, Guderian, de Gaulle. These names became associated with armored warfare theory during the interwar period. Each studied World War I tank operations, including Cambrai, and drew conclusions about mechanized warfare's future. Their theories varied significantly. Fuller envisioned tank forces as independent arms capable of deep operations without infantry support. Liddell Hart emphasized mechanization's role in enabling indirect approach, attacking enemy vulnerabilities rather than engaging strengths directly. Guderian focused on combined arms integration, with tanks working closely with motorized infantry, artillery, and air power. De Gaulle stressed the importance of professional armored forces as rapid reaction capabilities. These weren't abstract academic debates. They represented competing visions of future warfare with profound implications for force structure, training, equipment procurement, and operational planning. Nations that adopted effective armored doctrines gained significant advantages in World War II's early campaigns. Those that misunderstood or rejected mechanization suffered devastating defeats. The connection between Cambrai, that foggy November morning in 1917, and Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939-1940 runs through this interwar theoretical development. The technology demonstrated at Cambrai provided material basis. The theorists provided conceptual frameworks. The combination transformed warfare. The ethical dimensions of armored warfare received less attention than tactical or strategic considerations, yet they deserve recognition. Tanks represented increasingly industrialized, mechanized killing. Warfare where human operators directed machines that delivered death at range, often without direct visual contact with targets. This distancing, physical and psychological, between warrior and victim characterized emerging 20th century warfare. Tank crews destroyed enemy positions, killed enemy soldiers, and devastated fortifications while experiencing combat through vision slits and periscopes that abstracted and mediated violence. German soldiers described tanks as inhuman, monstrous, reactions not just to physical threat, but to the impersonality of mechanized warfare. Traditional combat, however horrible, involved direct human engagement. Mechanized warfare interposed machines between combatants, creating psychological distance even at physical proximity. Some theorists argued this dehumanization made warfare more brutal. Others contended it made violence more controllable. Machine operators could receive orders and execute missions with less emotional interference than soldiers in close combat. The reality probably involved both dynamics. Mechanization enabled greater destructive capacity, while psychologically distancing operators from violence's consequences. This tension between technological capability and human moral reasoning remains unresolved. Modern warfare continues the trajectory that Cambrai represented. Increasingly sophisticated machines mediating increasingly abstract violence. The ethical questions posed by mechanized warfare in 1917 remain relevant today, though contemporary technology raises them in forms World War I soldiers couldn't have imagined. The commemoration of Cambrai reveals how selective historical memory can be. The battle receives less attention than the Somme, Verdun, or Passchendaele, partly because its territorial results proved temporary, partly because its strategic impact manifested gradually rather than immediately. Museums display Mark IV tanks as technological curiosities rather than revolutionary weapons. Memorials honor the dead but rarely explain why Cambrai mattered strategically. This selective remembrance reflects how societies process military history. Dramatic losses like the Somme, where thousands died for minimal gain, create powerful narratives of sacrifice and tragedy. Battles like Cambrai, where innovation pointed toward future possibilities but didn't immediately end the war, fit less comfortably into national narratives. Yet historians increasingly recognize Cambrai's significance precisely because it demonstrated transformation without providing decisive victory. The battle showed that stalemate could be broken, that technology could shift warfare's balance, that innovation mattered. These lessons, though less emotionally compelling than tales of heroic sacrifice, proved more strategically important. The soldiers who died at Cambrai deserve remembrance not primarily for their sacrifice, though that warrants honor, but for their role in demonstrating that the Western Front's horrors weren't inevitable, that alternatives to attritional slaughter existed, that human ingenuity could overcome tactical stalemate. This isn't the narrative of noble sacrifice unto death, but of pragmatic innovation towards survivable victory. It's perhaps less inspiring, but more truthful. Mortimer's final report on the Cambrai operation, dated December 15, 1917, concluded with observations that transcended immediate tactical concerns. We proved tanks can break defensive lines. We also proved that breakthrough alone achieves nothing without exploitation, consolidation, and sustained supply. Future success requires treating armored warfare not as alternative to combined arms operations, but as component within them. The tank is neither independent war winner nor mere infantry support. It is specialized capability requiring integration with all combat arms. I believe future wars will see greatly improved tanks, better coordination, more sophisticated tactics, but the fundamental truth remains. War is human endeavor. Machines extend our capabilities, but don't replace human judgment, courage, and leadership. The fog of war exists inside tanks as surely as it exists on open battlefields. Technology reduces some uncertainties while creating others. Our duty is neither to worship nor reject innovation, but to understand it clearly, integrate it wisely, and employ it effectively in service of strategic objectives. Cambrai taught us this lesson. Whether we learn it remains to be seen. Mortimer died in 1962, having witnessed how World War II validated some predictions while contradicting others. His cautious optimism about technological warfare's potential, tempered by recognition of war's unchanging human dimensions, proved more accurate than either enthusiastic technophilia or reactionary rejection. The tension he identified between technological possibility and human limitation remains central to military thinking. The Cambrai battlefield fell silent on December 7, 1917, when British forces withdrew to defensive positions after German counterattacks recaptured most lost territory. The Mark IV tanks that had broken the Hindenburg Line were either destroyed, captured, or withdrawn for maintenance. The wire was restrung, the trenches reoccupied, the front lines re-established. Superficially, nothing had changed. The war continued its grinding stalemate. Soldiers returned to patterns established over 3 years, rotating between front lines, support positions, and rest areas, enduring artillery bombardments, launching small-scale attacks, suffering steady casualties without decisive results. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Everyone who'd participated in Cambrai, British soldiers who'd advanced miles and hours, German defenders who'd watched invulnerable machines crush their positions, commanders who'd witnessed breakthrough and exploitation, knew that stalemate could be broken. The question was no longer whether offense could overcome defense, but how to translate tactical breakthrough into strategic victory. This shift from impossibility to implementational challenge represented profound psychological transformation. Soldiers could see beyond the trenches. Commanders could plan for mobile operations. The war's eventual outcome, Allied victory through sustained offensives in 1918, reflected lessons learned at Cambrai and applied systematically across the front. The legacy of November 20th, 1917, extends far beyond military history into questions of innovation, adaptation, and human agency in technological change. Cambrai demonstrated that technological disruption doesn't automatically transform institutions or practices. New capabilities create possibilities, but realizing those possibilities requires organizational change, doctrinal development, resource reallocation, and cultural adaptation. The tank existed before Cambrai. The technology was available. What happened at Cambrai was systematic application of that technology according to operational concepts that maximized its strengths while mitigating its weaknesses. This distinction between technological availability and effective employment matters enormously. Many innovations fail not because the technology doesn't work, but because organizations cannot or will not integrate them effectively. Conversely, mature technologies sometimes produce revolutionary effects when employed in novel ways. The lesson isn't that technology determines outcomes, it's that human decisions about how to develop, integrate, and employ technology determine whether innovation produces transformation. Cambrai succeeded because British officers thought carefully about how to use tanks, then executed that vision despite institutional resistance and resource constraints. The technology mattered, but so did human imagination, institutional commitment, and operational competence. This interplay between technological possibility and human agency shapes all innovation, military or otherwise. On the 100th anniversary of Cambrai in 2017, veterans associations, military historians, and local communities commemorated the battle with ceremonies, exhibitions, and scholarly conferences. Participants discussed tactical innovations, strategic implications, and individual experiences. Yet perhaps the most poignant moment came when conservators demonstrated a restored Mark IV tank, driving it slowly across a field near the original battlefield. The engine roared, the tracks clanked, the ground shook slightly as 28 tons of riveted steel rolled past. Observers, mostly elderly, some in military uniform, some civilians, watched in silence. The tank wasn't traveling toward enemy lines, wasn't crashing through wire, wasn't operating in combat. It was simply moving, demonstrating mechanical possibility, showing what those November mornings in 1917 sounded and looked like. Some observers cried. Many were descendants of men who'd served at Cambrai, either in tanks or facing them. The demonstration lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Then the tank stopped, the engine shut down, and silence returned. In that silence resided everything Cambrai represented: the promise of technological solutions to tactical problems, the limitations of mechanical systems, the human cost of innovation, the transformation of warfare from individual combat to industrial process, and the eternal truth that behind every machine, every tactic, every battle, stand human beings making choices and enduring consequences. The forgotten trench war that broke the German line deserves remembrance not as glorious victory or tragic defeat, but as pivotal demonstration of possibility. Cambrai showed that stalemate could end, that innovation mattered, that courage and intelligence applied to technological capabilities could transform warfare. The battle's immediate results proved limited. Territorial gains proved temporary. Casualties remained severe. Strategic impact was modest. But the conceptual breakthrough, the demonstration that properly employed armor could achieve what 3 years of conventional attacks could not, resonated through military thinking for decades. Every successful armored operation in World War II, every tank doctrine developed by post-war militaries, every theoretical framework for combined arms mechanized warfare traces intellectual lineage to those foggy November fields near Cambrai. The men who fought there, in tanks and against them, were pioneering forms of warfare they barely understood. They were test cases in an experiment whose results wouldn't be fully known for decades. Some survived to see their innovations vindicated. Most did not. But their legacy, the transformation of warfare from static attrition to mobile combined arms operations, shaped the 20th century as profoundly as any technological or political development. That legacy began on November 20th, 1917, when 476 tanks drove toward the Hindenburg Line and proved that the future, however uncertain and costly, would differ fundamentally from the past.